If you were told a murderous militant Al-Qaeda leader had put a hit on you and marked you for death while you were in their territory, would you consider it a good time to leave? Or would you go against all advice and do the exact opposite, meeting them face to face? Well, not everyone has Barry's balls of steel. This story has some heavy details involved to give you a full understanding of the situation Barry finds himself in, but it's well worth the journey. Hey guys, welcome to Bent Planet, where I tell you true stories of humans in abnormal predicaments. Tales that will twist your mind. And this story is no exception. Alright, get comfortable. Are you ready to hear a story? A brutal amount of blood has been spilled over years of conflict in Somalia. Invasions, colonialism, military interventions, and constant internal battles for power. This has caused devastating side effects on the population, who are just trying to survive but quickly become injured in the violent crossfire. Militia groups take advantage of this by controlling food supplies. Food and hunger are then used as tools for power. Remember the film Black Hawk Down? The story set in Mogadishu, Somalia's capital, in 1993. While trying to feed starving people, United Nations peacekeepers and humanitarians were being targeted and killed. During a relief effort to restore order, US choppers were shot down and many lives were lost. Flash forward to 2006, things are just as brutal. A coalition has formed between rival insurgent groups to create one strong, united force of terrorists whose primary goal is to establish an Islamic State in Somalia. They are called Al-Shabaab, a ruthless organisation with no regard for human life when it stands in the way of their objective, constantly carrying out deadly attacks right across East Africa, and again controlling people by controlling the food supplies. And to make matters worse, a monsoon had arrived with insane flooding, leaving hundreds of thousands of people starving. This is where humanitarian agencies step in, and in Somalia this was desperately needed. But how do you drop into a situation like this without being targeted, having the food stolen, and being killed in the conflict? Well, when food is scarce, militia groups begin to lose power because they no longer have control over the food supplies. This is when humanitarian agencies negotiate with the militia groups to be allowed into these areas without being harmed. At times, the militia groups claim responsibility for bringing the food in themselves, maintaining control over the people. It is a two-edged sword, but at least people are being fed. So who's responsible for negotiating this access? Who meets with the heads of hardcore militia groups who have already vowed to kill foreigners? Imagine being the guy running these security operations. Well, meet Barry. As an ex-army security specialist, Barry was part of a team in charge of coordinating the safety and security of humanitarian relief in Somalia. One of his first major accomplishments was uniting together a bunch of militia groups and then organising them to provide security for the humanitarian workers. These are guys who were still operating independently. They hadn't joined Al-Shabaab. This move not only stopped them from fighting each other, but it also gave them a mutual goal: to protect the humanitarian workers from being attacked by larger forces like the Al-Shabaab. This, of course, allowed food to be distributed, which in turn fed their own clans and families. But you've also got to have balls of steel to unify and lead a group like this. And the job didn't come without its threats, such as one day when a huge amount of the collective stormed into the compound where Barry was working, all carrying their AK-47 assault rifles. They decided that Barry must have access to large amounts of money, and they demanded he hand some over. Barry faced them, and not wanting to drag out any unnecessary negotiation, he asked them if they thought it was possible to fit all of the barrels of all of their rifles on the top of his head, because they could all do that and blow his brains out before they were going to receive any money. After all, they were already being well looked after by all their clan chiefs, and taking money off him was not part of the deal. This was enough to convince them that Barry was completely nuts and not worth messing with. It also earned him their respect, so back to work they went. And with a twist of dark humour, this collective of militia groups called themselves the G8, a reference to the G8 summit where world leaders gather to make unified decisions. Not everyone was happy to have Barry around though. Remember the Al-Shabaab? Their presence was strong, always a possible threat. A large group of them monitored the local airstrip, and at times Barry would get stuck at the airport while they halted all the planes in order to perform their daily prayers, bowing down with their AK-47s on the ground at their foreheads. With the devastation of the monsoon floods at their peak, Barry was told he needed to coordinate food drops along a body of water called the Juba River, where people were cut off from supplies. This was not an easy task. If sourcing the boats and training drivers to navigate treacherous waters wasn't enough to think about, he also needed to make arrangements with the Al-Shabaab to get permission to pass through the areas that they controlled. A volatile and risky business. So, he negotiated the situation with the Al-Shabaab chiefs, and eventually they guaranteed his security, knowing that their people needed aid. Though it did come under a tough condition, the delivery needed to take place the next day, an unexpected deadline. That night, back at the work compound, Barry is on his satellite phone, rushing to coordinate the relief effort. He's slowly walking around as you do when you're engrossed in conversation, and he wanders out past where the workers often stray for a quiet cigarette break. It was night time and he was out there in the dark, focused on his conversation, when all of a sudden, bang, he was falling. Barry had jumped out of plenty of airplanes in the army, and he knew all too well the feeling of being hurled towards the earth at the speed of gravity. It felt like forever, but before he knew it, he bounced off a dirt wall and landed face down on hard earth and rock. Bruised and battered with the wind knocked out of him, he rolls around, looks up, and realizes that he's fallen into an old dried up well shaft, narrowly missing a huge tree branch sticking upward out of the dirt that would have impaled him if he hadn't bounced off the wall. Some of his colleagues who were nearby heard him shout out and then disappear. They'd presumed he'd been grabbed by Al-Shabaab militants, but eventually they located him, calling out from 8 meters under the earth. They threw a rope down to him, which he tied around his waist, and then they attached it to a car and hit the gas to pull him out. He shot up the wall, but as he neared the lip of the well, his weight caused the rope to dig into the earth rather than slide over it, pulling his body against the wall of the well, almost strangling the life out of him before anyone realised and stopped the car. By the time he did get pulled up to safety, he was scratched to pieces and in major pain, but he still had a food drop to organise, so he smashed a bunch of painkillers, doused himself in betadine, and got some sleep. The next day he had 9 boats, basic skiffs with outboard motors, completely stacked with food supplies, ready to race down a flooded river full of floating debris and shifting sandbanks, not to mention hippos and crocodiles. Not an easy task. It was a grueling day, offloading aid to as many people as they could reach, and by the time they gave away the last sack of grain, darkness was already setting in, which wasn't good as the boats didn't have headlights. Barry led the team, driving the boat at the front, using nothing but a handheld torch to light the way through the pitch black night. At one point, in an attempt to skirt around a wide bend, his boat bounced over an unexpected sandbar, sending it into shallow water where it skidded to a stop on top of 3 huge crocodiles. They thrashed about violently, shaking the boat, scaring the shit out of everyone, while the other 8 boats rammed into the back of them one after the other. When they finally made it back to base, the Al-Shabaab chiefs pull Barry aside and tell him they can't believe he pulled the mission off. They had heard about him falling down the well the night before and had given him a nickname, a word meaning something that falls. Barry had officially become the Fall Guy. But the appreciation didn't last long. At the time of this boat operation, a logistics manager had decided to bring in thousands of barrels of aviation fuel to the airstrip to make it easier for humanitarian aircrafts to refuel. Shortly after this, the US decided to fully back Ethiopia's war against Somalia, and they began to bring their own helicopters into the country for the first time since the Black Hawk Down disaster in '93. Once the US and the Ethiopian army realized there was so much fuel available at the humanitarian airstrip, they began using it for their own missions against the Somali forces, against the Al-Shabaab. So what did the Al-Shabaab deduce from this? Based on the timing of the fuel delivery, they figured that Barry had organised the entire boat operation as a cover, a way of distracting the al-Shabaab while they snuck in fuel for the US and Ethiopian forces to use in attacks against them. They decided that Barry wasn't a humanitarian worker at all. He must have been a CIA operative. The news was passed from the al-Shabaab at the airstrip, who witnessed the fuel delivery, up the chain of command until it reached the top al-Shabaab and al-Qaeda leaders in the area, who then made it official. Barry needed to be killed. Before Barry realised this assassination order was even in motion, his work compound had already been surrounded by Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab warriors, all fully armed and screaming demands to have him handed over to them. This is your worst nightmare in a country that has a history of killing UN peacekeepers. His G8 security team had to kick into action. As the standoff gained tension overnight, they managed to sneak in a bunch of guns and ammunition, then organising their security squad in a convoy of vehicles armed to the teeth with heavy machine guns. Barry was positioned in one of the centre vehicles. They all squashed in around him, lined up the cars, readied their guns, and then hit the gas to get out of there. They tore out of the compound and pushed through the angry mob, and despite the bloodlust in the air, the Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda were too put off by the amount of firepower Barry's G8 crew were pointing at them as they escaped, so they held themselves back from engaging in a shootout. As Barry raced past them, he noticed many of them wore potato sacks over their heads with eye holes cut out, like something out of a Halloween movie, a seriously haunting image of the enemy that wants you dead. So at this point, everyone is advising Barry to pack up and get the hell out of Somalia. Things have become way too dangerous, and he still has no idea why he's even being targeted. Does he call it a day, avoid the punishment of having a price on his head, and get the first flight out of there? Well, that wouldn't be very hardcore, would it? Barry isn't willing to sacrifice all the work he's done in the region. He's there to make sure it's safe for humanitarian food deliveries to reach desperate, starving people. There's no time for a replacement to arrive and become familiar with the conditions and all the connections he's made to achieve this. So he decides to take a huge chance, to put himself directly into the firing line in the hope that he can continue doing his job. Barry calls one of his trusted Somali colleagues and directs him to make a critical phone call, to make contact with Mukhtar Robow, a top Al-Shabaab leader and spokesman for Al-Qaeda. Mukhtar Robow was a seriously violent figure. He had been known to personally behead his own militia when they acted too far out of line, and the US government placed a $5 million bounty on his head. And Barry wanted to meet him, face to face. This was an incredibly intense decision to make. Barry knew that Robow could use this opportunity to have him executed. On the flip side, Robow could also assume that this was a trap by the CIA or US military to have him killed. But he was also intrigued that someone being hunted would wish to meet the hunter. A few days later, word came back from Robow. He was willing to meet. So it was organised. Barry, his security assistant, and one of their chief logistics officers were put onto a plane and flown to a secret location chosen by Robow. Once they landed, they were instructed to sit down on the ground by the airstrip and wait for Robow to meet them there. You can imagine the possibilities raging through their minds at this point, not certain whether their death was moments away. But true to his word, Robow arrived. The reason he wanted them to stay close to the plane was for his own protection. Robow knew that the US wouldn't rain down any hellfire from a drone attack if he stayed close to Barry's crew and the only plane that could get them out of there. So Robow sits down cross-legged on the ground with them, his short paratrooper AK-47 beside him, and the first thing he does is lean forward and ask, "You guys think I'm a terrorist? Are you worried that I'm going to eat you? Are you scared?" His assistant translates and Barry responds with warm laughter. No, not at all. I'm actually quite intrigued to meet you. I've met a lot of freedom fighters and rebels around the world. You're just defending your people in your own way. It's not my business. I'm a humanitarian. I'm here purely to gain access to communities that need food for survival. But I do have something to raise with you. You think that I work for the CIA. Firstly, I'm an Australian. not American. Yes, I served in the military, but this led me into the field I'm in now, supporting operations to get food to starving people. My military training has taught me a few things though, and I'll tell you what. Had I been running your team down at the airport, where all the aviation fuel was kept for so long, on hearing that the US and Ethiopian forces were on their way, I would have set off a demolition and destroyed all that fuel immediately. Then none of the US choppers would have gotten a drop of it. The only reason your guys are telling you that I set it up for the American forces is to cover up for their own incompetence. I had nothing to do with it. I'm too busy delivering food to your starving people. And then with a final statement to seal the deal, Barry then said to Rob Al, look, if the Al-Shabaab continues to threaten the lives of humanitarian staff, this will only result in your people being left to starve. And then the only person responsible for this that they will look to and blame is you. The logistics officer then explains to Rob Al that the fuel had been stored there to be used by humanitarian aircraft only, prior to any knowledge of the US arriving. Rob Al looked at them and, impressed with their speech, smiled and assured them that the Al-Shabaab would not interfere with the supplying of food to the Somali people, and he would withdraw the execution order hanging over Barry's head. So once again, the balls of steel saved the day, and Barry's decision to look directly into the eyes of the man who controlled life and death in the area had paid off. Alright, that's a wrap on today's story. Thanks for tuning in. Let Barry know you enjoyed it by hitting the like button. I feel honoured that he shared his story with me so that I can pass it on to you. If you'd like to hear the full interview, the link is in the description below. If you have your own story that you believe worth sharing, please email me. Those details are below too. That's it from Ben Planet. Until the next story, stay bent.